In the span of just 18 months, the Roman Empire witnessed something unprecedented in its 700-year history. 4 different men claimed the purple of imperial power, and 3 of them died violently for it. The year 69 AD became known as the Year of the Four Emperors, a period so chaotic that it nearly tore apart the greatest empire the world had ever known. This wasn't just political intrigue. This was a revolving door of civil war that would see emperors rise and fall with breathtaking speed, legions march on Rome itself, and the very foundations of imperial power tested to their breaking point. What started as a provincial rebellion in distant Gaul would spiral into an empire-wide cataclysm that changed Rome forever, leaving behind a trail of blood, betrayal, and broken promises that would echo through history. But how did the mighty Roman Empire, which had conquered the known world, find itself on the brink of total collapse in just one catastrophic year? To understand this unprecedented crisis, we must first go back to where it all began, with the death of Emperor Nero in June of 68 AD. Nero's suicide marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the imperial bloodline that had ruled Rome for nearly a century since Augustus first became emperor. For the first time since the establishment of the Principate, there was no clear heir, no obvious successor waiting in the wings. The Senate, which had been marginalized for decades under imperial rule, suddenly found itself in the unprecedented position of choosing a new emperor. Their choice was Servius Sulpicius Galba, the elderly governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, who had already declared himself emperor and marched on Rome with the backing of his legions. At 73 years old, Galba seemed like a safe choice, a respected senator from an ancient patrician family, with decades of military experience and a reputation for stern discipline. But as Galba made his way toward the capital, accepting the purple and the loyalty of legion after legion, few could have predicted that his reign would last less than 7 months, and that his death would trigger a chain reaction of violence that would consume the empire. The stage was set for a year, unlike any other in Roman history. Galba's march to Rome in the autumn of 68 AD should have been a triumph, but instead it revealed the first cracks in what would become a devastating fault line running through the empire. As the new emperor made his way through Gaul and into Italy, he began making decisions that would prove ruinous for his reign and for Rome itself. His first major mistake was his treatment of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards and who had grown accustomed to generous bonuses upon the accession of each new ruler. Galba, determined to restore fiscal discipline to an empire nearly bankrupted by Nero's excesses, refused to pay the traditional donativum, the customary gift of money that cemented the guards' loyalty to their new emperor. This decision sent shockwaves through the ranks of Rome's most powerful military unit, men who held the keys to the imperial palace and who had the power to make or break emperors. But Galba's penny pinching went far beyond the Praetorian Guard. He began systematically refusing to honor the promises made by his supporters during his march to power, alienating the very people who had helped him claim the throne. Even more dangerously, he began recalling gifts and privileges granted by Nero, creating a growing list of enemies among Rome's elite who found their fortunes suddenly at risk. The old emperor seemed determined to prove his incorruptibility, but in doing so, he was signing his own death warrant. While Galba struggled with the political realities of rule in Rome, a far more dangerous threat was brewing in the northern frontier of the empire, in Germania Superior. Marcus Salvius Otho, the governor of Lusitania, who had been one of Galba's earliest supporters, had harbored secret hopes that the old emperor would adopt him as his heir and successor. Otho was no ordinary provincial governor. He was a man with deep connections to the imperial court, having once been married to Poppaea Sabina before she became Nero's wife, and he possessed the kind of political sophistication and personal charm that made him a natural candidate for higher office. But as the months passed and no adoption came, Otho's patience began to wear thin, and his ambitions began to take a darker turn. He began making discreet inquiries among his contacts in Rome, testing the waters for support and gauging the loyalty of key military commanders and political figures. At the same time, in the Rhine legions of Germania, another crisis was developing that would soon explode into open rebellion. The legions stationed along the Rhine were among the most battle-hardened in the entire Roman army, veterans of countless campaigns against Germanic tribes who had spent years defending the empire's most dangerous frontier. These men had grown accustomed to regular combat, generous bonuses for victories, and the respect that came with being Rome's frontline defenders against barbarian incursions. The legions stationed along the Rhine had refused to take the traditional oath of loyalty to Galba on New Year's Day of 69 AD, instead declaring their allegiance to the Senate and people of Rome. A formula that everyone understood was a barely veiled rejection of the emperor's authority. The ceremony itself had been a tense and uncomfortable affair, with centurions reading the traditional formulae while their men stood in sullen silence, their faces betraying the anger and resentment that had been building for months. The soldiers were furious about Galba's refusal to pay promised bonuses, but more than that, they felt abandoned and betrayed by an emperor who seemed more concerned with balancing the books than rewarding their loyalty. They had heard stories of their comrades in other provinces receiving generous rewards from previous emperors, and they could not understand why their own service was being valued so cheaply. On the 2nd of January, just one day after their unprecedented refusal to swear allegiance to Galba, the Rhine legions took an even more dramatic step. They proclaimed their own commander, Aulus Vitellius, as emperor. Vitellius himself was caught off guard by his soldiers' initiative, but he was not a man to refuse such an opportunity when it was thrust upon him. The die was cast, and the empire now had two men claiming the purple, each with legions ready to die for their cause. But the bloodshed had only just begun. As news of Vitellius's proclamation spread across the empire, Galba found himself facing a military threat unlike anything Rome had seen since the civil wars that had brought Augustus to power over a century earlier. The Rhine legions were veterans of countless campaigns against Germanic tribes who knew both victory and defeat intimately. These were not the pampered garrison troops of peaceful provinces, but hardened warriors who had spent years fighting in the dense forests and treacherous marshlands beyond the Rhine, where a single mistake could mean death or capture by barbarian enemies. Their loyalty to Vitellius was born not just of material grievances, but of genuine affection for a commander who had shared their hardships and understood their needs. Under Vitellius's command, these legions began their march toward Italy, and their advance sent tremors of fear through every corner of the empire. The sight of Roman legions marching not against foreign enemies, but toward the heart of the empire itself, was a spectacle that hadn't been seen for generations, and it reminded everyone of the terrible price of civil war. But Galba's response to this existential threat revealed the full extent of his political incompetence and his fatal misunderstanding of the forces he was dealing with. Rather than moving decisively to crush the rebellion or attempting to negotiate a peaceful resolution, the elderly emperor seemed paralyzed by indecision and increasingly out of touch with the reality of his situation. His morning audiences with senators and advisors became exercises in futility, as he refused to acknowledge the gravity of the crisis or to take the decisive action that might have saved his throne. His advisors, led by the freedman Isolus and the prefect Cornelius Laco, were widely despised for their greed and incompetence, and their counsel only served to further isolate Galba from potential allies and supporters. Isolus, in particular, had become notorious for selling imperial favors and positions to the highest bidder, creating a network of corruption that extended throughout the imperial administration. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, Marcus Salvius Otho was quietly building his own conspiracy, using his charm and political connections to win over key members of the Praetorian Guard who were already disaffected with Galba's rule. Otho's approach was subtle and sophisticated, involving carefully orchestrated meetings in private homes and discreet conversations in bathhouses and taverns throughout the city. He promised the Praetorians not only the traditional donativum that Galba had refused to pay, but additional bonuses that would make them wealthy beyond their dreams. The emperor, oblivious to the growing threats both within and without the capital, continued to believe that his authority alone would be sufficient to maintain order. He could not have been more wrong, and his miscalculation would soon cost him everything. The final days of Galba's reign unfolded with the grim inevitability of a Greek tragedy, as the emperor's last desperate gambit to save his throne only accelerated his downfall. On the 10th of January, 69 AD, with Vitellius's legions advancing steadily toward Italy and rumors of conspiracy swirling through Rome's streets, Galba finally decided to name an heir, but his choice would prove to be his final and most fatal mistake. Instead of adopting the ambitious and well-connected Otho, who had been expecting the honor and who commanded significant support among the Praetorian Guard, Galba chose Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus, a young nobleman of impeccable lineage but no political base or military experience. The adoption ceremony, held in the camp of the Praetorian Guard, was meant to demonstrate the continuity of imperial power and to rally the troops to the emperor's cause. Instead, it served as the final provocation that pushed Otho from secret conspiracy into open rebellion. as the spurned governor realized that his dreams of imperial power would never be fulfilled through legitimate means. The Praetorians, already resentful of Galba's refusal to pay their traditional bonus, saw in Piso's adoption not the promise of stability, but the threat of continued austerity under another emperor who owed them nothing. As Galba left the Praetorian camp that day, confident that he had secured his dynasty's future, he was actually walking toward his death, betrayed by the very men whose loyalty he had taken for granted. The countdown to revolution had begun, and it would be measured not in months or weeks, but in hours. What happened next would shock even the violence-hardened citizens of Rome, as the most powerful man in the world was butchered in broad daylight in the heart of his own capital. On the morning of the 15th of January, 69 AD, just 5 days after adopting Piso as his heir, Galba received reports that the Praetorian Guard had proclaimed Otho as emperor and were marching on the palace. The old emperor, faced with the collapse of his authority, made one final, fatal decision. Rather than barricading himself in the palace or attempting to flee the city, he chose to meet the crisis head-on by appearing in the forum to rally the people to his cause. It was an act of either supreme courage or supreme folly, and the result was swift and brutal. As Galba's litter made its way through the streets of Rome, accompanied by a handful of loyal German bodyguards and a few remaining supporters, they were met by a detachment of Praetorian cavalry near the Lacus Curtius in the Roman Forum. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre, as the elite soldiers who had sworn to protect the emperor instead turned their swords against him. Galba, despite his advanced age, reportedly faced his death with dignity, offering his neck to the blade and asking only that the deed be done quickly if it was for the good of Rome. His adopted son Piso was hunted down and killed shortly afterward, along with several of Galba's key supporters, their heads displayed on spears as trophies of Otho's victory. In the span of a few hours, the Roman Empire had witnessed its second change of emperor in less than 7 months, and the streets of the capital ran red with imperial blood. Otho's victory seemed complete as he was acclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard and recognized by the Senate, but his triumph would prove to be as short-lived as it was bloody. The new emperor faced an immediate and overwhelming challenge. Vitellius and his Rhine legions were still marching toward Italy, and they showed no signs of recognizing Otho's claim to the purple. What had begun as a rebellion against Galba had now become a contest between two rival emperors, each backed by different segments of the Roman military, and each determined to be the sole ruler of the empire. The situation was unprecedented in Roman history. Never before had the empire witnessed simultaneous civil wars with multiple claimants to the throne advancing on each other with the full backing of professional legions. Otho, despite his reputation as a pleasure-seeking courtier, proved surprisingly effective in the early days of his reign, moving quickly to secure the loyalty of key military units and dispatching armies to northern Italy to block Vitellius's advance. He immediately ordered the mobilization of the urban cohorts, the vigiles, and every available military unit in and around Rome, transforming the capital into an armed camp buzzing with military preparation. His promises of generous bonuses finally began to win over the Praetorian Guard completely, as he paid not only the traditional donativum, but additional sums that demonstrated his commitment to rewarding military loyalty. The emperor personally took command of his forces, demonstrating a level of military competence that surprised both his supporters and his enemies. Those who had known him only as Nero's former companion and a lover of luxury were shocked to see him don military dress and address his troops with the confidence and authority of a seasoned commander. But as the two armies converged on the plains of northern Italy, it became clear that this would not be a simple matter of one battle deciding the fate of the empire. The logistical challenges alone were staggering. Feeding, housing, and coordinating the movements of tens of thousands of soldiers across the difficult terrain of the Po Valley required organizational skills that tested even the most experienced military commanders. The Roman legions, the greatest military force the world had ever known, were about to turn their weapons against each other in a civil war that would test the very foundations of Roman power. Veterans who had served together in Germania, Britain, and along the Danube frontier now found themselves preparing to kill former comrades in arms for the sake of competing imperial ambitions. The question was no longer who would emerge victorious, but whether the empire itself would survive the coming storm. The decisive moment came on the 14th of April, 69 AD, At the First Battle of Bedriacum, a small town in northern Italy that would become synonymous with Roman civil war, Otho had deployed his forces strategically, hoping to use the superior training and equipment of the Praetorian Guard and the urban cohorts to overcome Vitellius's more numerous but less disciplined Germanic legions. The battle itself was a confused and brutal affair, with both sides demonstrating the tactical excellence that had made Roman arms feared across the known world, but now turned against fellow Romans in a fratricidal struggle for power. The fighting raged for hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. But as the day wore on, the superior numbers and desperate determination of Vitellius's forces began to tell, and Otho's army found itself slowly but inexorably pushed back across the battlefield. The emperor himself was not present at the battle, having remained at his headquarters in Brixellum, waiting for news of victory or defeat that would determine his fate and the fate of the empire. When the messengers finally arrived with word of his army's defeat, Otho faced a choice that would define not only his own legacy, but also set the stage for the next phase of Rome's year of chaos. He could continue the fight, rallying his remaining forces and drawing the civil war out for months or even years, or he could accept defeat and spare the empire further bloodshed. What Otho did next shocked everyone who knew him, and forever changed how history would remember the man who had murdered his way to the throne. Rather than continuing a civil war that could tear the empire apart, the emperor chose to take his own life, reportedly saying that he would not be the cause of further Roman bloodshed. On the 16th of April, 69 AD, just 3 months after his violent seizure of power, and only 2 days after his defeat at Bedriacum, Marcus Salvius Otho committed suicide in his quarters at Brixellum, bringing his brief reign to a dramatic and unexpected end. His final act was witnessed by his closest supporters, who later reported that the emperor faced death with a courage and dignity that few had expected from the former courtier and conspirator. The news of Otho's suicide spread rapidly throughout his remaining forces, causing entire legions to dissolve, as soldiers either fled to their homes or switched their allegiance to the victorious Vitellius. It was a stunning conclusion to what had seemed like an unstoppable rise to power, and it left many Romans wondering whether they had completely misjudged the character of the man who had briefly worn the purple. But even as Otho's funeral pyre burned, and Vitellius prepared to enter Rome as the undisputed emperor, few could have predicted that the year's bloodshed was far from over. In the eastern provinces of the empire, another claimant was already being proclaimed by his legions, and the year of 4 emperors was about to enter its final and most decisive phase. Vitellius's march into Rome in the summer of 69 AD should have marked the end of the civil war and the beginning of a new era of stability, but instead it revealed the depths of corruption and indiscipline that the year of chaos had unleashed across the empire. The new emperor, a man known more for his appetite for luxury and excess than for any military or political acumen, allowed his Germanic and Gallic legions to treat Rome like a conquered city rather than the capital they were sworn to protect. These soldiers, many of whom had never seen the marble temples and golden statues of the Eternal City, were overwhelmed by the wealth and splendor that surrounded them, and their officers proved either unwilling or unable to maintain proper discipline. The soldiers, flush with victory and hungry for the spoils of war, engaged in widespread looting and violence, terrorizing the civilian population and showing complete disregard for the traditional restraints that had once governed Roman military conduct. Shops were ransacked, private homes invaded, and citizens assaulted in broad daylight by men who were supposed to be their protectors. The contrast with the disciplined behavior expected of Roman legionaries was stark and deeply troubling to those who witnessed it. Vitellius himself seemed incapable of controlling his own troops, spending his time organizing elaborate banquets and gladiatorial games while his empire teetered on the edge of financial and administrative collapse. His legendary appetite became the stuff of scandal throughout Rome, as stories circulated of feasts lasting from noon until midnight, featuring exotic delicacies imported from the far corners of the empire at enormous expense. The imperial treasury, already depleted by the expenses of multiple civil wars, was further drained by the emperor's extravagant lifestyle and his need to keep his unruly soldiers satisfied with constant bonuses and rewards. Provincial governors sent increasingly desperate messages to Rome reporting that tax collection had virtually ceased in many areas as local populations fled their homes to escape the chaos and violence that had engulfed the empire. But while Vitellius indulged himself in Rome, a far more serious threat was developing in the eastern provinces, where Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known to history as Vespasian, was leading the Roman campaign against the Jewish rebellion in Palestine. The veteran general, who had spent decades serving the empire with distinction, watched the chaos in Rome with growing alarm and increasing determination to restore order to the Roman world. Unlike his predecessors, Vespasian commanded not only military loyalty, but also the respect of provincial administrators, client kings, and local elites throughout the eastern Mediterranean who had grown weary of the constant instability emanating from the capital. The stage was being set for the final act of the Year of Four Emperors, and this time the outcome would reshape the empire forever. The proclamation of Vespasian as emperor by the legions of Egypt and Syria on the 1st of July 69 AD marked the beginning of the end for Vitellius and the start of what would become the Flavian dynasty's rise to power. Unlike the previous claimants to the purple, Vespasian brought to his bid for imperial power a combination of military experience, administrative competence, and political wisdom that had been sorely lacking in the year's previous emperors. The veteran general had served with distinction in Britain under Claudius, had proven his abilities as a provincial governor, and most importantly, he commanded the absolute loyalty of the battle-hardened legions that were currently besieging Jerusalem and suppressing the Jewish revolt. These eastern legions were among the most experienced and disciplined in the entire Roman army, having spent years fighting in the challenging terrain of Palestine against an enemy that combined religious fanaticism with sophisticated guerrilla warfare tactics. His proclamation was not the result of a hasty conspiracy or a moment of opportunistic ambition, but rather the culmination of careful planning and broad-based support from across the eastern provinces of the empire. The initiative had actually come from his subordinates and allies who had grown increasingly concerned about the chaos in Rome and had concluded that only a military leader like Vespasian could restore stability to the empire. The prefect of Egypt, Tiberius Julius Alexander, immediately declared his support for Vespasian, giving the new claimant control of the vital grain supplies that fed the city of Rome itself. This was a strategic masterstroke that none of the previous contenders had thought to secure. Control of Egypt meant control of the grain fleet that kept Rome's 1 million inhabitants fed, and it gave Vespasian a weapon that could bring the capital to its knees without a single battle. Within weeks, the governors of Syria, Palestine, and other eastern provinces had joined the growing coalition, bringing with them some of the most experienced and disciplined legions in the entire Roman army. Client kings throughout the region, from Herod Agrippa in Palestine to Antiochus of Commagene, declared their support for the Flavian cause, providing additional troops and, crucially, financial resources to sustain a long campaign. But Vespasian faced a crucial strategic decision. Should he march immediately on Rome to confront Vitellius, or should he first secure his position in the east and allow his supporters in Europe to prepare the ground for his eventual arrival? The choice he made would determine not only his own fate, but the future course of Roman history. For Vespasian, the decision to remain in the east while his supporters advanced on Italy proved to be a masterstroke of strategic planning that demonstrated why he would succeed where others had failed. Rather than rushing headlong into another destructive civil war, the future emperor carefully orchestrated a campaign that would minimize bloodshed while maximizing his chances of ultimate victory. He delegated command of the advance into Europe to his most trusted lieutenant, Marcus Antonius Primus, a capable general who had the political connections and military experience necessary to rally support for the Vespasian cause throughout the Danubian provinces. Meanwhile, Vespasian used his time in the east to consolidate his power base, secure crucial alliances, and most importantly, to present himself as the candidate of stability and competence, in contrast to the chaos and incompetence that had characterized the reigns of his predecessors. His propaganda campaign was remarkably effective, portraying him as the experienced leader who could restore order to the empire and end the cycle of violence that had consumed Rome for over a year. The eastern provinces responded enthusiastically to this message, providing Vespasian with the financial resources and military manpower he needed to sustain a long campaign. As autumn approached and his forces prepared for the final confrontation with Vitellius, Vespasian had positioned himself not just as another contender for the throne, but as the empire's best hope for lasting peace and stability. The Second Battle of Bedriacum, fought on the 24th of October 69 AD, would prove to be the decisive engagement of the entire Year of Four Emperors, as Vespasian forces met Vitellius's army on the same blood-soaked plains where Otho had met his defeat just 6 months earlier. The battle was a testament to the superior discipline and generalship of Vespasian's commanders. As Marcus Antonius Primus outmaneuvered and outfought the Vitellian forces, in engagement that demonstrated why the future emperor had chosen his subordinates so carefully. The fighting was fierce, but relatively brief, as Vitellius's troops, demoralized by months of indiscipline and uncertain leadership, broke under the pressure of a coordinated assault by legions that had never forgotten what it meant to be professional Roman soldiers. The defeat was total and crushing, with thousands of Vitellian troops either killed in the battle or captured as they attempted to flee the field. News of the disaster reached Rome within days, triggering a complete collapse of Vitellius's authority as legion after legion declared for Vespasian, and the Senate began preparing to switch sides once again. But Vitellius, unlike Otho before him, was not prepared to accept defeat gracefully or to spare the empire further bloodshed through honorable suicide. Instead, the doomed emperor retreated to Rome and prepared for a final, desperate siege that would bring the civil war directly into the heart of the capital and threaten to destroy the city itself. The year of 4 emperors was about to reach its bloody climax in the streets and temples of Rome itself. The final siege of Rome in December of 69 AD brought the year of 4 emperors to its violent and chaotic conclusion, as the Eternal City became a battlefield for the last time in its long history. Vitellius, trapped in the imperial palace with a handful of loyal supporters and increasingly desperate German bodyguards, watched helplessly as Vespasian forces surrounded the city and began systematically capturing key strategic points throughout the capital. The most dramatic moment came when fighting erupted around the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, the most sacred site in all of Rome and the symbolic heart of the empire's religious and political authority. During the battle, the ancient temple caught fire and burned to the ground, an omen so terrible that it sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world and convinced many that the gods themselves had abandoned the city. Vitellius himself met his end on the 20th of December, 69 AD, when he was dragged from his hiding place in the palace and murdered by Vespasian's soldiers, his body thrown into the Tiber River like a common criminal, rather than given the funeral rites due to a former emperor. With Vitellius's death, the year of 4 emperors finally came to an end, but the scars it left on the Roman Empire would take decades to heal. The city of Rome lay partially in ruins, the imperial treasury was empty, entire legions had been destroyed or disbanded, and the very concept of imperial authority had been fundamentally undermined by a year in which 4 different men had claimed the purple, and 3 had died violently for it. The arrival of Vespasian in Rome in the summer of 70 AD marked not just the end of the year of 4 emperors, but the beginning of a new chapter in Roman imperial history that would see the empire reach new heights of prosperity and territorial expansion. The founder of the Flavian dynasty brought to the throne a clear understanding that imperial power depended not on the whims of the Praetorian Guard or the favour of the Roman mob, but on the loyal support of the legions and the effective governance of the provinces. His first priority was the reconstruction of Rome itself, including the rebuilding of the Temple of Jupiter and the construction of the great amphitheatre that would become known as the Colosseum, projects that demonstrated both his commitment to restoring Roman greatness and his understanding of the importance of public spectacle in maintaining imperial authority. But perhaps his greatest achievement was his success in restoring stability and legitimacy to the imperial office itself, proving that the Principate established by Augustus could survive even the most severe constitutional crisis and emerge stronger than before. The year of 4 emperors had tested the Roman Empire to its very limits, revealing both the fragility of imperial power and the remarkable resilience of Roman institutions and Roman society. The lessons learned from that terrible year would influence imperial policy for generations to come, as future emperors understood that their authority depended not on their birth or their political connections, but on their ability to maintain the loyalty of the army and to govern effectively in the interests of the empire as a whole. In the end, the year of 4 emperors had not destroyed the Roman Empire, but had instead forged it into something stronger, more stable, and more enduring than it had ever been before.